Quite a big room, too.
Yeah. Okay, we're live. Okay. Right, good evening, everyone. I think we're going to start the proceedings now. Thank you all very much for being here, and I'd like to thank the South London Israel Forum for organising this. So I'll start with telling you about the author. David Stone is a clinical epidemiologist. He has advised UK governments, the European Union and the World Health Organization on a wide range of public health topics. He has published extensively on public health topics and served as the chair of the International Society for Child and Adolescent Injury Prevention. All of his work is predicated on the importance of an evidence-based approach. He's an academic advisor to Stand With Us UK, an educational NGO that advocates for peace based on education. Now, the evidence-based approach, which I talked about, no doubt you'll understand, comes in handy when you're writing a book about such a large topic. So let me just summarize the book for you very quickly. There seems to be a large blind spot for the lethal anti-Semitism that has long blighted Muslim countries and remains prevalent today throughout the Middle East and the world. This collective failure of vision has been responsible for inflicting incalculable and avoidable suffering on generations of both Jews and Arabs. So, I've read this book. It's really unique in that it's got this evidence-based approach, but it's really accessible, it's really clear, and it covers such a huge breadth of topics, and it addresses all the difficult questions. It talks about all the underreported things, from Nazi propaganda in the Middle East to October the 7th, and the reactions to the October the 7th massacre, and things like the UN, the BBC, everything that you can think of, and it ties it all together. It's a really masterful account, and it identifies the issues and gives answers as well. So we look forward to you solving the Arab-Israeli conflict tonight, David. Thank you. Unusually, it presents counter-arguments. It says these are the arguments which people will give against this, and then it deconstructs those arguments. So, David, you're a medical epidemiologist. You could have written a nice, easy book about disease and catastrophe about diseases. But instead, you decided to pick the most controversial subject in the world. You opened up a real can of worms. What on earth were you thinking writing this?
Well, Alex, I often ask myself that question. I think I was very reluctant to write this book as it happens. I resisted the idea for many, many years until it became a kind of compulsion. I can't pretend I enjoyed the experience. Anybody here who has grappled with the topic of anti-Semitism or has had direct experience of it will know just what a depressing subject this is that we're dealing with this evening. And actually, that gave me an insight as to the issue. Why was I so resistant to the notion of addressing anti-Semitism within the conflict? One of the things that occurred to me was over many years I've been reading about the conflict, learning about it, experiencing it directly as a result of spending several years in Israel. And it occurred to me that although there are hundreds, probably thousands, maybe tens of thousands of books about anti-Semitism, and maybe tens of thousands of books about the Arab-Israeli conflict, I couldn't find a single one that combined the two. Now, maybe somebody in this room can fill that gap in my knowledge, but I couldn't find one, and I've done internet searches. There are lots of articles which attempt to do that, But no book has been written which tries to bring together those two troubling aspects of human behavior. Before I get into the details of really why I wrote this book, let me just tell you something that occurred to me as I was walking around this district of Wimbledon. I got here a bit early to avoid the rush hour, and I took a walk and discovered I was walking past Centre Court. And it took me back to my childhood. When I was about 10, I was a keen tennis player. And I aspired to play at Wimbledon, to be Wimbledon champion. At the very least, to make an appearance at the competition. So I didn't quite get there, but I feel I am playing Wimbledon this evening, which is rather nice. But the point is, when I reached a certain age, it might have been 25, it might have been 35, whenever it was, I relinquished the delusion that one day I would be Wimbledon champion. I suppose there was an outside possibility that that particular aspiration might have come to pass, but the fact is it didn't, and I had to let it go.
And another Scotsman beat you to it.
Exactly. And I'm very happy for him. And that's what most of us do. We nurse aspirations. Some of them become obsessive. Some of them become a little bit delusional. But what happens to them, for most of us, we relinquish them when they come into direct conflict with reality. But there are two groups of people who don't relinquish delusions. One group, unfortunately, suffer from a mental illness called schizophrenia. It affects about 1% of the population. Let me just digress for a moment, tell you a little anecdote. I live in Finchley, not far from the civil courts, if any of you know that area. And I often walk past the courts, and about twice a week, a young man is standing outside the court holding up a placard. And the placard says, everybody is microchipped in the brain by the intelligence services. Now, in terms of his external appearance, he's well dressed, he's well turned out. He's not homeless, or as far as one can tell, he's not alcoholic or a drug addict. The poor chap probably suffers from schizophrenia. That's if the rest of his life is intact, and by the look of him I would suggest it probably is, he's what we call in the medical trade, he's suffering from a circumscribed delusion. He's just got this one idée fixe that we all have microchips inserted in the brain, but otherwise he can function, fully function, make a living, perhaps establish relationships. So that's one group of people, schizophrenics, 1% of the population. But there's another group of people who don't relinquish delusions in the face of reality, and that group are anti-Semites. It doesn't matter the degree to which you present them with factual evidence. It's an immovable delusion which comprises paranoid ideas, conspiracy theories, and a complete detachment from reality. So you can see already that my medical background has been influencing my thinking about this topic. That's the topic of anti-Semitism, but how does that relate to the conflict itself? One of the things that puzzled me, and perhaps puzzles many of you here, is why it is this conflict has lasted over 100 years. What is it about this conflict that makes it utterly resistant to resolution? After all, we keep hearing from distinguished journalists, who I won't name, but we can guess who they are. We keep hearing that this is fundamentally a territorial conflict. Two groups of people are fighting over a narrow strip of land. And the reason there is a conflict and it hasn't been resolved is because both sides see it as a zero-sum game. In other words, they have to have all of it or none of it. It just so happens that that is untrue. The evidence is overwhelming that that is untrue. One group of people, namely the Arab world and their Iranian backers and the rest of the international community that supports Israel's enemies, for them it's a zero-sum game. From the river to the sea is a zero-sum statement. Now, for most Israeli governments, and you will find exceptions here and there, but throughout most of Israel's history, there have always been leaders who have said, we can compromise, we can reach a deal, we can agree to a partition, we can divide the territory. It's a tiny territory, but we'll find a way of doing it. We'll sit down, we'll negotiate, and we'll come to an agreement. And when I looked at the history and I put together these two notions of the nature of anti-Semitism and the presence of an extreme anti-Israel agenda, not just amongst Israel's neighbors, but in the wider world, it occurred to me that what I could do is try to bring, if you like, an epidemiological perspective on the conflict. Now, I'm going to have to give you a short crash course in epidemiology now, so bear with me, it won't last very long, maximum 2 minutes. So what is epidemiology? Epidemiology is essentially the study of epidemics, the study of pandemics. Actually, I probably don't need to tell you about it, because since the pandemic, most people know now what epidemiologists do. But we study epidemics, we study pandemics. The late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talked about anti-Semitism being a virus that constantly mutates. So you can see there's a connection there, conceptually, with the notion of an epidemic or a pandemic. And what we do is we look at the population, we identify diseases, deviations from health, and we try to make a community diagnosis. Just as a clinician makes clinical diagnosis, an epidemiologist makes a population or a community diagnosis. If we get that diagnosis right, we can tailor the interventions at a public health level. Like, for example, getting people to wear seatbelts, or to stop smoking, or to eat a healthy diet. But if we get that diagnosis wrong, we can't solve the disease that's come to our attention. So back to anti-Semitism, within the conflict. What I did was I hypothesized, this was all happening inside my head. By this stage, I hadn't put down a single word, but I hypothesized the diagnosis of the Arab-Israeli conflict was fundamentally wrong. It's not a territorial dispute. But because people think it's a territorial dispute, they bring to bear on it the tools of diplomacy and international politics and negotiations and pressure on both sides to compromise, and it's completely failed. If, on the other hand, the diagnosis really relates to something much more difficult to deal with, the notion that one side of this conflict harbors a delusional notion of their adversaries, it's hardly a surprise the conflict has continued.
And by delusion, of course, you don't mean it in the medical sense, because there are people suffering from delusion and they can't help it. These people are voluntarily choosing to ignore the facts. And this misdiagnosis that you're speaking about is so very, very common. It's become doctrine. So there's no diversity of thought. It's become a norm, and people that question it get shouted down. Students can lose their grades and be excluded from their classes and hounded out of their colleges. So it's this misdiagnosis has become the fact, and no one's allowed to question this fact. So you're really going against the grain here by saying, actually, there's something wrong, and here's why, and breaking that down.
That's correct, and I agree with almost everything you've said there, except for one thing. I don't think it's a conscious choice on the part of most people. I think it's part of a kind of worldview. I mean, we can see this on the hard left. It's become a necessary part of being admitted to the progressive left, is to blame Israel for everything that has gone wrong and for perpetuating the conflict. But for many people, it has just become part of common sense. It's part of the environment that they live in. Nobody really questions the assertions that are made by the mainstream media that Israel's responses, for example, currently, in the current war, are disproportionate. Nobody seriously questions that. For many people, especially on the hard left, but also on the far right as well, the idea that Israelis are committing genocide is not fundamentally questioned. We have the example of a Scottish National Party member who was expelled recently for holding abhorrent views. He was expelled from the party for holding abhorrent views about Israel. And what was the abhorrent views? His view was that Israel was not committing genocide against the Palestinians. That was the abhorrent view.
And for those who don't know, genocide has a specific definition, and it's a very short definition. It fits on an A4. So it's very easy to actually prove that that is not the case.
Correct. It amounts to a delusional belief. It's very easy to demonstrate that Israel is not committing genocide and has never attempted to commit genocide. And that is true of a lot of other allegations that are made about Israel, including ethnic cleansing, including racist attitudes to Palestinians. Yes, you will find extremist Israelis, just as you will find extremist Scots and you will find extremist Brits. But the idea that these are fundamentally intrinsic to Israel and to the Zionist movement is demonstrably false. But that's where we come up against this brick wall, this denialism. Just to go back to the issue of anti-Semitism, I'm sure many of you will remember Sharansky's 3 Ds of anti-Semitism. That's demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. And these 3 Ds have become incorporated and developed into the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. They have a definition of anti-Semitism, which is widely accepted throughout the Jewish world and increasingly accepted in the non-Jewish world as well. But there's a 4th D, I think, to Sharansky's 3 Ds that we now have to take on board, and that is D for denialism. I may even encounter some of it here this evening, I don't know. But whenever this issue of anti-Semitism is raised, either in relation to the conflict itself or to the position of Jews in the diaspora, what we hear, very often we get a pushback which suggests that we are somehow attempting to weaponize anti-Semitism, that we are using anti-Semitism to shield Israeli policies or to snuff out criticism of Israel. And again, if you look at the evidence, it just doesn't stack up. It isn't true. But that notion that anti-Semitism can't explain what is happening in the Middle East plays no part, or a very peripheral part, or perhaps is an epiphenomenon, is a result of the conflict, not a cause of the conflict. That is something I encountered certainly throughout my academic career. And you still hear it very widely expressed today.
Do you think that this idea, this notion that Jews are constantly lying about anti-Semitism simply goes back to the idea of the tricky Jew, the lying Jew? I mean, Wilhelm Marr, who coined the term anti-Semitism, making it racial term, said the same thing. He said, well, people will no doubt call me anti-Semitic, call me anti-Jewish, and it will be a lie.
Yeah, well, Marr himself actually was an anti-Semite.
Yeah, a massive one.
That's right. And there is a problem with the term. I mean, the term itself, it doesn't explain anything. It's a descriptive label, if you like. It explains nothing.
Do you think it's similar to the term anti-Zionism?
I think it is, and it's often used interchangeably or juxtaposed with it. But I was very influenced by a book written by a historian called Daniel Goldhagen. Some of you may have heard that name. And he wrote an extraordinary book. It was published, I think, in the mid-1990s, called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And what Goldhagen said was, we have misunderstood the cause of the Shoah, the Holocaust. We've misunderstood it. And actually, his arguments, they were so influential in my thinking that you will find them in this book, if any of you feel inclined to read it. And what Goldhagen was saying was, the conceptualization of what happened in the 1930s and 40s is based on the false notion that a small minority of extremists, of anti-Semites, grabbed the levers of power, including military levers and the judicial system, and were able to enforce their extreme view and were able to impose it on the wider population, most of whom didn't share their extreme anti-Semitism. And Goldhagen puts forward very powerful evidence that that cannot have been true, because the scale of what happened during that genocide could not have been achieved without the collaboration of millions and millions of Germans, not the minority, not the 1% of complete schizophrenics, if you like, but they recruited to the cause very, very large numbers of Germans, including people in the mainstream, academics, doctors, politicians of all political parties, artists, writers, philosophers, churches, trade unionists, from all walks of life. And what Goldhagen posited, which I found very persuasive as a way of explaining the inexplicable, because after all, in the end of the day, what happened in Nazi Germany remains inexplicable. We can't get our heads around it. But what he said was, in order to understand how this could have happened, you have to recognize something that he called a culturally shared cognitive model of Jews. In other words, it wasn't a minority, it was a majority who had absorbed, as a result of intergenerational effects over many centuries, a culturally shared model of Jews. Now, that culturally shared model didn't necessarily require that Jews be killed, except for a minority may have held that view. But what it did was it provided a backcloth, or whatever metaphor you wish to use, a culture medium, an environment, which made it possible for the final solution to take place. It didn't mean that all Germans were happy with this course of action. Far from it. We know that there were many who were not. But what it did mean was that there was a critical mass within the population that had internalized this model through no fault of their own. They were brought up with it. They were inculcated with it by their parents and their grandparents and all the previous generations, going back deep into German Christian history. And I think that's a very important insight. It still remains a hypothesis, and many historians viciously attacked Goldhagen. They were outraged, including, I was surprised to read the late Yehuda Bauer, who's an Israeli historian who died in his 90s very recently. And he opposed Goldhagen, and many historians do. But that doesn't mean Goldhagen was wrong, and I would urge people to read that book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. Now, I think a similar culturally shared cognitive model of Jews pertains in the Middle East. You know, there have been many studies, if you like, epidemiological studies, of the prevalence of anti-Semitism around the world, and the Middle East has the highest prevalence of anti-Semitism. It's about 75% of the population hold one or more major anti-Semitic ideas, by which I mean ideas such as that Jews control the media, or that Jews run all the world's major governments, or that Jews were responsible for all the wars in the world. 75% of the Middle Eastern population subscribe to these ideas. The highest proportion are to be found in the West Bank and Gaza. The lowest proportion in the Middle East, and this may surprise you, is to be found in Iran. It's still a high proportion. It's still around 60%, but it's not in the 80s and 90s that you will find elsewhere in the Arab world. Now, what is going on here? In Europe, incidentally, just by way of comparison, it's somewhere in the 30s and 40s, probably much higher now as a result of the events of the last year. So what is going on here? Well, if you look at the evidence, look at the way the conflict has unfolded, look at the way it started approximately 100 years ago. The very first Palestinian Arab leader was Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was a virulent anti-Semite. And he was a member of and a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood that came into being in Egypt in the 1920s. And today's Islamist organizations, whether we're talking about Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or Hezbollah or Hamas, they draw their inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood. And they all adhere to this virulently anti-Semitic worldview. And Hajj Amin al-Husseini was the first Arab leader, Palestinian leader. They didn't call themselves Palestinians at that time. But that has been perpetuated from generation to generation. Now, the rest of the world has not been prepared to confront this. Not in the way they confronted anti-Semitism in Europe. And actually, what was achieved in Germany after 1945 was quite extraordinary. There was a global effort backed by huge resources from the Marshall Plan and elsewhere to denazify the German people. And it largely worked. Doesn't mean there are no Nazis left in Germany. There are some. And they may be making a comeback today. But by and large, that denazification program worked. The reason it worked was because it happened. And the reason it happened because the diagnosis was correct.
Even though it was faulty in many ways.
It was faulty, but
it was there.
It was there. There's been no comparable diagnosis in the Middle East, and the result is we've had 100 years of conflict. And what I'm suggesting in the book is because we have consistently failed to get this diagnosis right, we're in for another 100 years of conflict. We must get the diagnosis right if we want the conflict to end.
But why won't people believe the Islamist leaders when they say it's a religious conflict? We want to kill all these Jews in the Middle East, and we will not stop until we have achieved that. Why does the West insist upon putting this political veneer upon these issues when these people are so clear about what their motivations?
Part of it is because many people have never heard what they have to say. I mean, you won't hear in our mainstream media today, you won't hear any of these virulently anti-Semitic statements from Islamist leaders. You just will not hear it in the media. Why not? Well, I don't have an answer to that, Alex. I think one rather glib way of putting it is it conflicts with the narrative. It conflicts with the narrative is it's a territorial dispute. And what we need are two sets of leaders at the same time who are willing to compromise. And actually the narrative goes a bit further than that, that it's the Israelis who are uncompromising and not not the Arabs. But fundamentally, we don't have an explanation for that, but it is a troubling phenomenon. It seems that even the most educated, the most influential, the most sophisticated commentators and journalists in today's world are either unaware of what Islamists are saying, or if they are aware of it, they're not prepared to communicate that to the wider public. And that in itself is a disturbing realization.
Perhaps it's to do with their oppressor paradigm and worldview, where they see imperialism, anti-imperialism, and on the side of imperialism you have the UK, America and Israel, and on anti-imperialist side you have Russia, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, etc., etc. But the point that I would like to go back to is you talked about the same models, and this is a really pertinent question. We've seen on the streets swastikas being waved by so-called anti-racists, and they don't get challenged. They don't lose any of their anti-racist credentials. Where else could you go and wave a swastika other than about Jews on the street? It's unbelievable. This is a very frightening time for Jews. Some people here went to the JW3 event and were screamed at by some very well-organized and frightening people. And they chant about ending Zionism. I don't think there's another community centre that people would go to and shout about the identity and where those people belong and don't belong and where they should go back to. So, and you talked about academia as well. There was some really interesting research after year 2000 that academics actually inherently were Nazified before the Nazis came along, and not just that, they moulded Nazi policy. And here we're seeing academia, again, moulding and shaping these ideas and taking it as a norm. So, are people right to be concerned about this? And is our holiday from history over?
I think the answer to both is yes. So we need to be concerned. Obviously, as Jews, we're in the front line here. I mean, let's bear in mind, as Alex was saying earlier, if Islamist groups achieve their ambition to destroy the Jews of the Middle East, that was, of course, Husseini's ambition. And the front cover of the book shows a picture of Husseini meeting a senior Nazi official. Hitler said to Husseini, "The Jews of the Middle East are yours." There was a plan to complete the final solution in the Middle East by obliterating all Middle East's Jews. Again, this is never discussed. If they were to succeed, which is a horrifying thought, who would be next? We would be next. Most people sitting in this room would be next. They would be coming after us. One of the reasons I felt a compulsion to write this book, and I think this happens to most of us when we approach the age of maturity, let me put it that way, we start thinking about our legacy, we start thinking about what kind of world our children and our grandchildren are going to be inheriting. And it's frankly a terrifying prospect. And that's why Israel can't afford to lose this war. And that's why, from our personal perspectives as Jews, we have to be clear that Israel must win this war, because if they don't, we are next in the firing line. So, and that comes back to an earlier question that you posed, Alex. You know, what motivated me to write this book? Part of it is fear of what the future may hold for our children and our grandchildren. At this point, let me just relate another anecdote to you about a great uncle of mine. So that was my grandfather's brother, who was a bit of an eccentric. He'd served in the First World War, and he was a great raconteur. And he used to come round and play chess with my father, and I used to listen to their conversations. And one of the things I heard him say was that he had visited Munich in 1938. 1938, he went on holiday to Munich, to Bavaria. He was a young Jewish man. I remember my father asked him, why did you go, Mao? He was called Mausch colloquially. Why did you go there, Mausch, in such a dangerous time? He said, because we didn't think it was dangerous in 1938. It's only in retrospect that it sounds mad. But at the time, it seemed a reasonable thing to do. And the other thing he said was, the Glasgow Jewish community, which incidentally at that time was quite substantial, there were about 30,000 people in it before the war, they were split down the middle in the late 1930s. They were polarized, pretty much 50-50. Half believed that the Jews of Europe and the Jews of Germany in particular were in danger. Half believed it was all nonsense, it was exaggerated, this madman Hitler would soon be out of power. Germany was a sophisticated, educated country. It was all exaggerated. And this Uncle Mausch decided to go and take a look for himself. He enjoyed a pint of beer, so he went at the time of the Oktoberfest, and he made friends with local Germans, and he was drinking away in one of the beer kellers of Munich. Music was playing, he was chatting to the barman, who happened to be a Scot originally. And then suddenly the music stopped and all the lights came on. The doors were flung open, and in walked 2 or 3 members of a Gestapo unit with the swastika armbands. And they said, nothing to worry about, ladies and gentlemen. This uncle spoke some German because he knew Yiddish, so he could understand German. Nothing to worry about, we just want to check papers. Please have all your papers ready. So when they got round to his table, he produced his British passport. They looked at him highly suspiciously. They said to him, are you Aryan? And Mausch shrugged his shoulders. He didn't know what that meant. So he claimed. He said, I don't know what that means. He said, the Gestapo officer said, right, you'd better come with us. At that point, the barman, the Scot, rushed over and said, no, it's all right, officer, I can vouch for this man. I'm a Scot too. We Scots are as Aryan as you Germans. And that view prevailed, and the Gestapo officer handed Mausch back his passport, and he came back to Glasgow. He lived to tell the tale. Came back to Glasgow and said, you know what, there is something to worry about. And when I hear people today saying, you know, all this talk of anti-Semitism, it's exaggerated, it's going to blow over. And I look at the evidence, and I look at the evidence of the global pandemic of anti-Semitism, and I look at the way that anti-Semitism has fueled the Arab-Israeli conflict and fuels, in turn, anti-Semitism around the world. I'm very concerned about the future. And I just want to make one last point about this idea. Again, I emphasize we should not be fearful, but we should be concerned. Let me put it this way. The risks of underreacting to the threat of anti-Semitism in the 21st century far outweigh the risks of overreacting. That must be a lesson from history that we can all take.
Indeed, we have the hindsight now. So I'm going to ask some even more difficult questions, I think, because the book is full of difficult questions, and David purposely asks them so that he can answer them. Can anti-Semitism be combated? I mean, what's the point? It comes about again and again, and each time we recognize it and we say, oh, there it is, same stuff. They've changed the name, they've changed a few details, but we can see the link that they're so busy disavowing. So if we can't do anything about it, what's the point? Can we? What can we do to change this consistent virus?
Yeah, let me come back to the virus issue. If I forget, please remind me, Alex, because
Sure.
I think the metaphor is slightly flawed, but we can come back to that. So what can we do about it? It's a very common Jewish reaction to say that anti-Semitism has always been around, it will always be around, there's nothing we can do, it's just like the weather. Jewish passivity has always been bad news. Bad news for Jews. We cannot afford to be passive. Jews were passive for 2,000 years after the loss of sovereignty at the hands of the Romans. How did that go? It didn't go well. Eventually, a young Jewish journalist called Theodor Herzl came up with a response, and that was the re-establishment, the recreation of Jewish sovereignty in the ancestral homeland. So that was the invention of Zionism. There was a very good article written in Haaretz a number of years ago by the Israeli lawyer and politician called Amnon Rubinstein, who talked about the way Jews have tried pushing against a number of different gates. They've tried assimilation, they've tried the Enlightenment, they've tried full integration, they've tried autonomy. They all failed. Only the Zionist gate remains open for Jews. This raises another issue, which something that you didn't ask, but you mentioned it earlier on, the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Given that the debate within the Jewish world about Zionism effectively came to an end in 1945, when the sheer scale of the Shoah came to light, there was an argument between Zionist Jews and anti-Zionist Jews, as we know. In 1945, those arguments virtually ended, apart from a tiny, tiny minority. So when people say today that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, what are they actually saying? They're saying that for Jews who tried every other route to survival over 2 millennia and found that the only one that looked as if it held out the promise of survival was sovereignty, with power to determine our future, with the ability to defend ourselves. If anti-Zionists are saying it's not anti-Semitic to disempower us once again, well, I would say they're living on a different planet from the rest of us. So I don't believe that Zionism is a choice, actually, anymore for Jews. I believe it's an absolute fundamental necessity. It's been the only strategy throughout Jewish history that has protected us from disaster. And why we imagine that the world has changed so radically that in the 21st century, the prospects for Jewish survival would be any different than it was in the 11th century and the 1st century, well, I can't follow that line of reasoning when I look at the evidence of history.
So the big difference today is that we have Israel, obviously, to the reaction to past forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence. So the question that I would like to ask you is, did polarization in Israel play a part in October the 7th? And is there any blame that we can put on Israel for the way that things have turned out, for the environment that we're seeing in the Middle East?
So there are at least two questions there.
Wrapped into one.
So I'll try and answer them in turn. So polarization, it's often said that because Israel was such a polarized society in the early part of 2023, that Hamas saw the opportunity to pounce. But they themselves have said that this operation of October the 7th had been planned for years. Some said it was 3 years, some said it was 10 years. All the evidence suggests that the plan to invade and attack and murder on a large scale had been concocted long before the most recent Netanyahu government. So I think, again, looking at the evidence, I understand the argument that Israel looked vulnerable. Perhaps, I would concede, perhaps the timing was influenced by the increasing street demonstrations. But fundamentally, I don't believe that it was the cause of the attack. There's one other thing to say about polarization. And I'm quoting here the opposition leader Yair Lapid. He says, polarization isn't a bad thing. You'll find polarization in all democracies. We're certainly seeing polarization in the United States today. We had tremendous polarization in this country during the Brexit debate. Polarization is a sign of health of a democracy. It's not the sign of weakness. So it's perfectly possible for Israel, although it's a much smaller country than this one, it's perfectly possible for Israel to negotiate its way through highly contentious political arguments, while at the same time remaining vigilant about the need to defend its borders against murderers and intruders. It's possible to do both. So, actually, I often go back to David Ben-Gurion, who was, I think, one of the greatest political figures of the 20th century. I'm sure many people will agree with me on that. He was faced with a similar dilemma in the 1940s. On the one hand, he was fighting the British against the British betrayal of the mandate throughout their period of power in the territory that was supposed to become a Jewish national home. But at the same time, he recognized that the British were fighting the Nazis. So there was a tension there. And he said, well, the answer is actually quite simple. We'll fight the Nazis as if there were no mandate, and we will fight the mandate as if there was no war. It's possible to do two things at once, especially in a complex society. So we have to fight for fundamental democratic values within Israel at the same time as fighting the threats to Israel's integrity and survival from external enemies. And I think it's possible to do
Not
both.
an easy line to walk, certainly.
Not easy.
I think we're going to go to questions soon, but I'm just going to wind this up with a few more questions before we hand over to you guys to ask what you would like. And the first thing that I would like to talk about is the BBC and the media, which is another really big topic that and the NGOs, like the UN, with the halo effect. They're like the new church. What they say is the gospel truth, and they don't seem to like the Jews very much. And the BBC have had some issues, should we say? And interestingly, in David's book, it talks about their links with Qatar. They actually have an agreement with Qatar, with Al Jazeera, who are the mouthpiece of Qatar. So I would like to ask you, David, about the impact of the NGOs and the BBC and what part they have to play in creating this climate of hostility that we're all experiencing and seeing.
There's no doubt at all that the BBC are the world leaders in terms of opinion forming within the world of mainstream legacy media, if you like. Because you'll notice that whenever the BBC adopt a particular line on an incident, the others follow suit very quickly. At the very beginning of this conflict, people said, no, you shouldn't watch BBC, watch Sky. And then Sky actually became even worse than the BBC. And then people said, no, don't watch Sky, watch ITV News. I followed all of this advice and flip channels, as I'm sure many of you did, to see if you could find something that was more balanced, that was more impartial, as the BBC claimed to be. They are considered the gold standard of reporting. You'll notice when this most recent report came out about bias in the BBC,
The Assassin.
the Asserson report, the great and the good in the journalistic community rushed to the BBC's defence and said, this is an outrageous smear. The BBC, they're full of journalists of the highest integrity and impartiality and fairness and accuracy. That's another example where the evidence simply contradicts that view. It doesn't stand scrutiny. So people either promote that view because they believe it, or they promote the idea because the narrative has become more important to them than the evidence. So let's go back 20 years or so to an earlier report called the Balin Report. Does that ring a bell with people? The Balin Report in the early 2000s. It was around the time of the Second Intifada, where again the BBC were getting into difficulty because they were trying to be impartial. How you can be impartial between a liberal democracy whose citizens are being blown up on a daily basis in buses and supermarkets and cafes, and a genocidal terrorist organization. But be that as it may, they decided they had to be impartial. And they came in for a lot of criticism. So the senior management of the BBC recognized there was a problem and thought we'd better actually look at this in a systematic way. And they invited Balin to conduct an internal report. I don't know much about Balin, actually. Maybe you know something about him, Alex. I don't know much about him, but he was considered a highly respected figure. And he had the confidence both of the Jewish community and BBC reporters at the time. And he wrote a report which has never been published. It was presented to BBC management. People who know about such things tell us that the Balin report was highly critical of the BBC's reporting of the conflict. But the BBC refused, despite questions in Parliament, despite attempts to take them to court. They resisted and resisted, and it's estimated they spent well over £300,000 fighting legal cases under the Freedom of Information Act to stop the publication of the Balin report. And we have to ask, if they're so transparent, if they have such integrity, if they're so confident about their impartiality and accuracy, why are they not being transparent about this inquiry that they commissioned? Why would they rather spend hundreds of thousands of pounds of licence payers' money at a time when they were complaining they were running out of cash? It just doesn't make any sense. Again, you won't hear, for obvious reasons, you won't hear that mentioned in the current discourse around this topic. But it reminds me of an earlier episode going back to the 6-Day War. So I'm just about old enough to remember the 6-Day War, and some of you may also be just about old enough to remember the 6-Day War. I wonder if anybody else remembers a BBC reporter called Michael Elkin. Does that name ring a bell? Michael Elkin was the first reporter anywhere in the world to announce that Israel had won the 6-Day War. And he announced it on the second day of the 6 days. And what was the BBC's reaction? They fired him on the spot. Clearly, he's not being impartial. How can we have a journalist that says Israel has won? The rest of the Arab world doesn't believe it. Why should we believe this guy who happens to be a Jew? They fired him on the spot. Eventually, they had to reinstate him after a prolonged wrangle and threats of legal action. So going back a long way, going back to at least 1967 and possibly earlier, the BBC had trouble dealing with this issue. And there are many, many examples that we could fill an entire evening going through the BBC casebook on the distortions and the selectivity and the lack of accuracy and impartiality. Although we only really need to look at, you could take any week in throughout any of the last year, you could take any week of reporting and you could see the same phenomenon of a BBC that is reluctant to present a truly accurate, truly impartial, truly fair picture to its very large audiences.
And of course the BBC aren't worse than other places necessarily, it's just that they're considered the gold standard, and we pay for them as well, so that's why it's important. Now I could talk to David for, well, all evening really about this kind of stuff, but I'm sure you guys want to ask some questions. So what I'm going to say is thank you so much, David, for talking to us. It's been really fascinating, and I would also like to say how great his book is, in that it doesn't just give a potted history of everything, it gives answers, it solves problems, and it's really unique in that regard, and it's really accessible. It was very enjoyable, so I recommend it. So please join me in thanking David. Thank you. And, well, if you don't have any questions, I am happy to carry on and raise the level. But if you have a question, I don't think that we have a microphone. So I think I might have to turn mine around and then you come up and speak into the microphone. We have to speak into the microphone. Oh, but Judy, can we bring the mic over?
No. Come here, please.
I just want to...
Please come.
I'd like, if you can explain to me... Sorry. If you can explain to me why there are so many young Jewish people we see on these anti-Israel marches. Where does that come from? Why does that? Are they denying their Judaism? Are they denying the centrality of Israel to Judaism? Do you have any idea about that? Nothing.
It's an important question, and it's a complex subject. I think the first thing I would say is that you will find within all persecuted minorities a minority within the minority that turns on its own people. We saw this in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. We saw this in the civil rights movement in the United States. We saw it in that, well, those of us who were around will have seen it in Nazi Germany. There were Jews who supported Hitler. It's an extremely disturbing phenomenon. And we can't just dismiss it as Jewish self-hatred. It may be in some cases. I think in other cases it's a form of Jewish self-regard. These are people who think of themselves as virtuous. They feel good about themselves by saying, as a Jew, I utterly condemn A, B, and C. And of course, they are treated like royalty within the circles of people who embrace them. But I think my answer, if I'm forced to produce an answer, because I don't have a glib answer to it, but if I were to work towards an answer, I would say this: we are all products of our environment. We are being bombarded on a daily basis by accusations that Israel is committing war crimes, supported by the world Jewish community, that Zionism is inherently racist, that Israel was created by the expulsion of the Palestinian people, and so it goes on. And that is the environment that young people, including Jewish young people, are being brought up in. So it's hardly surprising that some of them have internalized that hatred. So this comes back to Goldhagen again. If you are living in an environment where there is a culturally shared model, it doesn't matter if it's of Jews or of gypsies or of homosexuals or of the Irish or of immigrants, you internalize that model, even to your own detriment. I think the other thing is that we are a traumatized people. We have been repeatedly traumatized over many, many generations. We are troubled by the situation we find ourselves in. And so some of us look to simple remedies, which is embracing our enemies. It's a kind of collective Stockholm syndrome, the identification with the aggressor. And it gives us some sort of solace. Those of us who adopt this course, it gives us some solace. It makes us feel wanted. It makes us feel worthy. It makes us feel not safe exactly, but safer than all those other people who don't share that view. That's probably the best I can come up with, but I'm not saying that that's the final answer.
I think that's a great answer, personally. I mean, we saw during the Corbyn years, if you said, I'm a Jew and I'm anti-Zionist, suddenly you got so much traction online. You went from having one retweet to thousands and thousands and being this popular figure online, and who could resist? You're conforming to this society, but it's an anti-Semitic society and people internalize it. So I think that was perfect.
Can
really.
I add something about my academic colleagues? Because there are many academics who've adopted this view that Zionism is evil and that therefore Jews are complicit in evil, even though they may not realize it. If you're an academic in 2024 and you put forward your platform, which is based on anti-Zionist mythology, and you write papers and you cite other anti-Zionist academics, you will very quickly become a global celebrity. I've seen this happen. You will be invited to conduct coast-to-coast lecture tours in the United States and to travel first class and stay in 5-star hotels. You will be treated like royalty. And unfortunately, human nature being what it is, for some people, especially academics who look as if they're going nowhere in their academic careers, they see that as an escape route from this oppressive feeling that their peers don't fully respect their worth and their achievements. So I think there's an element of that, certainly in the academic world.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, students can't find any arguments to the opposite because they're not provided.
I think that's a little bit unfair, actually, because I think that there's this dilemma, this rock and a hard place that as diaspora Jews we're caught in, which is our empathy and support for the state of Israel. And yet we're faced in a society where the reality that we, or the narrative that we're shown, is the reality of what's going on in Gaza as well. And in your answer, you're sort of conflating in the way that I don't think helps the narrative. You're either for Israel or against it. You're either a Zionist or you're not. Well, I'm a Zionist. Absolutely support the state of Israel and its right to exist and its right to defend itself. But I cannot support the current government and some of the positions that it takes. Now, we see Israel as a pluralistic society. We're informed, we're nuanced, we're aware of the discussions that are going on there. That's not what people out there see. They see the current Israeli government and they are quoted on radio for what is being said by the current Israeli government. And whenever I find myself out there trying to have a nuanced discussion and put another point of view, it's undermined by a reality. So, yeah, that was the point that I feel that's a little bit unfair. And I just want to bring it round to something else which is, perhaps more productive, which is what can we begin to do to counter anti-Semitism? Because taking your analogy of a disease flourishes in a body that is weak and where the circumstances are right for it. But my experience of anti-Semitism in my 66 years is that it comes and goes. It never goes away. But our bodies have sort of hostile bacteria, and we can live with them. But there are times when actually they take over. How do we combat disease? Well, by starving it. And actually, there are circumstances where you can isolate that disease, and you can isolate it from the vitriol that sort of feeds it. And that way you can do that. So my question to you, and a little bit of my implied answer is, is what can we do to begin to starve and combat the growth of anti-Semitism, and perhaps a more nuanced sort of discourse around Israel and Israeli politics might be a way.
So I love this question. I love your contribution, because as an academic, that's what I do. I'm constantly responding to challenges, and I like to be challenged. So you have challenged me on the issue of the Netanyahu government. I think we have to be very careful here, because if you follow the logic of the anti-Zionist position, I'm talking about the anti-Zionist position, it doesn't matter whether it's a Netanyahu government or an Ehud Olmert government or an Ehud Barak government or a Shimon Peres government or a Yair Lapid government. They will always attack whoever the prevailing leadership is within Israel, and they have done, and we can see that throughout Israel's history. In terms of Netanyahu himself, I'm sure you are aware of this, but he is regarded by most Israelis as actually rather cautious in the way he conducts military conflicts. Again, coming back to the data, if you look at the epidemiological evidence, if you like, if you look at casualty rates, okay, this has been an extreme year, but up until this war, Netanyahu inflicted fewer casualties against Palestinians, Lebanese, and others than any other prime minister before him. In fact, he was regularly attacked from the left for appeasing Hamas by ensuring that these bucket loads of cash were transferred to Hamas from Qatar over a number of years in an attempt to maintain quiet and stability in Gaza. So I'm not convinced about this attitude of this idea that it's to do with the Netanyahu government. And it's a standard ploy that you will very often hear people say, I'm not anti-Zionist, but I'm anti-Netanyahu. And then you ask them, well, which Israeli prime minister were you for? They usually say Yitzhak Rabin, because that suits the narrative, but you see he was murdered by an Israeli. And what people forget is that although Netanyahu has repeatedly stated, in principle, his support for the so-called two-state solution, and that's something we haven't really touched on, we'll maybe come back to that, Yitzhak Rabin never did. He never supported the establishment of a Palestinian state. In fact, he was actually deeply suspicious of Arafat's motives in signing the Oslo Accords, and it transpired that his suspicions were well-founded. You see what I'm getting at here, that it actually doesn't matter who is in power at any given time. You will always find Israel's critics, so-called, and I say so-called because I'm not talking about Israeli critics of government, because I don't know any Israelis who don't criticize their government from time to time. For that matter, I don't actually know any Jews who don't criticize the Israeli government from time to time. So this notion that it's all about just shutting down criticism is nonsensical. think the second part of your important contribution is what actually can we do about this? And I'm tempted to say, well, you have to read the book, because if I tell you now, then why would you read the book? But I think there are a number of things we can do. The most important thing, first of all, is to acknowledge the reality that anti-Semitism, you may not buy my hypothesis that it is the driving force of the conflict. I've presented evidence in the book that I believe is persuasive that it is the driving force of the conflict, but I hope you will at least concede, even if you're skeptical of that claim, that it is a major driving force of the conflict. It's not an epiphenomenon. It wasn't caused by Israel's actions. It was there right from the beginning, going right back to Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti, in the 1920s. So the first thing we have to do is get rid of the denialism. We have to call a spade a spade. It's hard, and I think it's particularly hard for Jews to do this. We're very good at saying, on the one hand, I go for this argument, on the other hand, I can see the other point of view. That's part of the Jewish intellectual tradition. And we love arguing. And we argue with ourselves as much as with other people. But in the case where there is such clear-cut evidence for this hypothesis I'm putting forward, I would say that it's actually time to stop being nuanced. It's actually time to stop saying on the one hand and on the other hand. It's time to stop saying we are guilty just as they are guilty, because that gets us back to this notion of moral symmetry, when there is none. There is no moral symmetry between a democracy, a tiny country fighting for survival, currently on 7 or 8 fronts, and a genocidal alliance of terrorist organizations bent on committing the kinds of atrocities we saw on October the 7th again and again and again. And how do we know that? Because they've told us. It's the point that Alex was making. Why do people not hear what people are telling us? And it's back to this denialism. I'm not accusing you of denialism, but I think there is a tendency to deny, or at least to minimize, and I believe we have to stop doing that. And that's the first step among several that I outline in the book that we have to get a grip of, and we have to do it unapologetically, and we have to do it decisively. And if we do that, then we can see some other steps opening up before us. But if we don't make that first step, we'll be trapped forever in this constant one hand on the other hand cycle of violence. We're as responsible as they are. That will get us nowhere, because fundamentally it's not evidence-based. That's my belief.
And of course, if anyone cared to ask the diaspora what we thought, they would know that Netanyahu has almost no support within the diaspora. So I think we're going to just crack on. Should we have this lady in the striped top, because she's been waiting, and then we can have you as well afterwards. Thanks.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. It's been absolutely brilliant. I was very interested in your what you suggested about the wrong diagnosis having been made regarding the territorial argument, and about it, one needs to, that diagnosis is wrong. Sorry?
Maybe face this way.
Okay, all right, sorry, it's a bit difficult. Okay. I was interested in the idea that the diagnosis is wrong, and I think we're all very familiar with the idea that the diagnosis can be wrong. But I was just wondering, I'm assuming that you've discussed the alternative diagnosis with Israelis, and I was wondering how they reacted to it and what you could suggest they could do about it.
Yeah, that's
the admirable short question.
That's an interesting question, a very important one, because there is an issue in Israel about anti-Semitism, and it's one that might surprise you if you don't know Israel. Anti-Semitism is almost never discussed in Israel. Anti-Semitism is not part of the Israeli discourse. Anti-Semitism is seen, or historically has been seen, things have changed somewhat in the last year. Historically, Israelis have viewed anti-Semitism as a problem for the galut, for the diaspora. It's seen as the problem that Zionism has solved. Turns out that was incorrect as well. They were wrong about that. And that reminds me of something else that happened a number of years ago. In 1988, I had just returned from living and working for a number of years in Israel. And I attended Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration of 40 years of Israel in Glasgow. And the guest speaker was somebody I'd never heard of. He was the former head of Israeli military intelligence in the 1950s, a fluent Arabic speaker, an Islamic scholar, and his name was Yehoshaphat Harkabi. I don't know if anybody has heard that name, Harkabi. He said something I didn't understand at the time. It's taken me 30 plus years to understand what he meant. And this is what he said. He said, I'm delighted to be here with you tonight, celebrating 40 years of Israel. But I have to tell you, there is a problem. The majority of Israel have got no concept of the quandary in which they find themselves. And what he was referring to was the annihilationist, genocidal anti-Semitism of the countries surrounding Israel. This was in 1988. And it's taken me all this time finally to grasp what he was trying to tell us. And that is that it's not just a Jewish unwillingness to confront this unpleasant truth. It's right there at the heart of Israeli society. I think it has changed since October the 7th. Just to compound the tragedy of what happened on that day, those communities that were attacked on the so-called Gaza envelope, and the communities near Gaza, they were the most dovish, left-wing, pro-Palestinian Israelis you could find anywhere else in the country. They employed Palestinians in their small businesses. They ferried Palestinian children to Hadassah Hospital for life-saving heart surgery. They believed in the two-state solution with all their hearts. They believed that that would bring peace, if only we, by which they meant on our side, if we had leaders with the imagination to actually implement the two-state solution. Of course, the two-state solution, while I've mentioned it, I'll just briefly add something about that. It's a misnomer. There is no two-state solution, and I'm speaking as somebody who has supported it throughout most of my adult life. But as I look at the evidence, as dispassionately as I can, with all the cognitive dissonance that sets up inside my head, I have to tell you there is no two-state solution in current circumstances. If there were such a thing as a two-state solution, the conflict would have ended decades ago, because it has been tried again and again, not just during Israel's existence, but in the period prior to Israel's establishment. Going right back to the Peel Commission, and before then, through to the UNSCOP, the United Nations Partition Plan, through to resolutions 242 and 338 after the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, through to the Barak and the Olmert and even the Netanyahu proposal. They've all been rejected. Why have they been rejected? Because for the Arab leadership, including the Palestinian leadership and their supporters, including the Iranians today, the two-state solution is not a solution. It's not what they want. Now, at this point, I must recommend another must-read book for you, is the book by Adi Schwartz and Inat Wilf called The War of Return. Absolute essential reading for anybody who wants to understand this conflict. And what they're arguing, with evidence that is highly persuasive, the war of 1948 has not ended in Arab eyes and Iranian eyes. It continues in 2024. And the rest of the world has indulged that view that there is still a war to be fought, a war of return. Why is there all this row about UNRWA and the funding of UNRWA? And the outrage when the Israeli Knesset passed a law, I think just yesterday or the day before, cutting off links with UNRWA. This is an organization that has perpetuated the view that the war of 1948 is not over. It's not an international aid agency. It's a Palestinian organization that has nurtured the notion of a non-existent right of return, and they will not give up that vision until the rest of the world tells them to give it up. And why should they give it up? They've had billions and billions of dollars thrown at them, most of which doesn't reach the people it's intended for.
So perhaps Israel is also previously guilty of this amnesia that has been affecting many parts of the world. Now, obviously, buy Anat Wilf's book after you buy David's. Should we have the next question, please? Thanks.
Hello, thank you. Alistair Rosenshine. Right at the very beginning of your talk, I thought of a book by Theodor Adorno, The Authoritarian Personality, which helped me to try and understand why people were anti-Semitic, why they're racist, and why a racist or an anti-Semite is a prejudiced person. And they don't only hate Jews, they also hate government, they hate the schoolmaster, and various other things, and that runs throughout their character. But my question to you is this. The left, in particular the left, they virtue signal that they're not racist. But equally so, they virtue signal that they're anti-Semites. The two things are not compatible, obviously. So my question to you is, how does one deal with this sort of thing? And how does one deal with the fact that amongst our community, there are Jews who are arguing for Palestinian rights, and one has to say, well, there are plenty of people arguing that. There are very few arguing the Israeli or the Jewish side. So there's my question to you.
Yeah, it's a fair question. And again, I don't have any simple answers to this. I think it's quite an extraordinary achievement by those on the left who actually have some insight into what we've been discussing, to sell the notion of a form of racism as something virtuous. How have we reached this point in the development of a society? And by society, I mean practically the international community. As we've seen and discussed in the case of UNRWA, the denialism goes so deep that even when it's been demonstrated that UNRWA personnel directly participated in the atrocities of October the 7th, that position barely shifts on the dial, and it's still regarded as something virtuous to promote and to support a blatantly anti-Semitic organization that is not just ideologically anti-Semitic, but acts out its anti-Semitism through violence. And we see it in these demonstrations, the calls for a global intifada. What does a global intifada mean? It means that we will be targets of the kind of violence that Israelis have been targets of. What does it mean from the river to the sea? That's a Hamas slogan. From the river to the sea, Hamas, Palestine will be free. That means free of Israel. And there's absolutely no question. When people say, oh, but they want a democratic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, well, the majority of Israelis now come from the Middle East. And 900,000 Jews were forced out of their homes with nothing since Israel's establishment. Those Jews who are now influential in Israel, and that's what many of us in the West complain about, because Israel appears to have moved to the right. That's a subject for another evening, I would suggest. But those Jews will just simply not accept the abandonment of self-determination. And why should they? It's in the UN Charter that all peoples have a right to self-determination. And yet, for the progressive, the hard left, there is one group of people who are not entitled to self-determination, and that's the Jewish people. So it's not really an answer to your question, but I think it sharpens the focus on this, that we are dealing with a troubling phenomenon for which none of us have come up with an effective answer.
I'd just like to make a few comments. It draws directly from Soviet propaganda. It's deeply unoriginal in that regard, and there's been some very interesting research published in Nature's Journal by Dr. David Hirsch and Dr. Daniel Allington, which shows that the biggest signal of anti-Semitism is a rejection of democracy, and it comes hand in hand with people who want to tear down the system, people who like dictatorships, people who support totalitarian regimes, all those kind of things. So it's not political in that sense. Anti-Semitism is about a contempt of the world around them, particularly liberty and rights.
Thanks very much, both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. Should we have this? Oh, sorry, Judy first. I think, Judy, did you have a question?
Am I allowed to ask a question? Judy Weleminski. I wanted actually to say something that you've just said, which is about the Soviets. And you've talked about the whole issue being delusional. But is part of the problem that from the Russian point of view, it's not delusional at all. It's very rational. It's a great way for them to reassert themselves through, as Iran is doing, through proxy throughout the Middle East. And I wondered whether there's also an angle that the Jews are a minority, a tiny minority, and tiny minorities are supposed to be almost imperceptible and unpowerful. And the problem is the Jews are very perceptible and very powerful, and that makes us a lightning rod for those who think that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a question, Judy, or a comment.
Do you agree?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I think there is a rational aspect to the Soviet propaganda. They certainly wanted to sow unrest in the West, and they wanted to do something about the growing influence of liberal democracy, particularly on the younger generation. And they poured literally hundreds of millions of rubles, I suppose they were, into a propaganda campaign in the West, targeting particularly Western university students. And I think that probably was rational from their point of view. But there comes a point, I think we'd probably have to look to social psychology to unpick this, but there comes a point where something that starts out with one set of motivations evolves into something else. So if you keep repeating to yourself a mantra that the Jews are our misfortune, the Jews are our misfortune, or the Zionists are our misfortune, and Israel is our misfortune, even though you don't really believe it, you've got other motivations for doing that. But you repeat it often enough, you will come to believe it. And I think there is some evidence in this. I'm venturing into dangerous waters here because I'm not an expert on social psychology. But there is some evidence from what I've read about cognitive behavioral therapy that people who have self-destructive attitudes, if they can't be persuaded through on the basis of evidence that their self-destructive attitude is harming them and is not based on evidence, the CBT approach is to say, well, look, whether or not you believe what I'm saying, just keep repeating to yourself, I am not a bad person. And the theory goes that by doing that repeatedly, you come to believe it. So, yes, I think it does have a rational basis in terms of global realpolitik, but it has evolved into something where people actually believe the narrative, whether or not they did at the outset.
Just to add to what this lady was saying, it's also Jewish charities who are doing great damage to Israel, like Yachad and the New Israel Fund. That's two of many others who are really doing damage to Israel. So watch out to those charities. Now, I was sorry. I'm loud enough, I think. I think everybody can hear me now.
Everybody thinks that, and it's not the case.
Okay. Now, Islam is on the march. They are spreading everywhere. We have huge numbers here. And in America and other places, the governments are afraid of them. As you can see, what happened with for the Labour Party, with the Muslims, they are going to listen to them. They're not going to listen to the few numbers of Jews in Britain or anywhere else. What do you think is going to happen in the future as the numbers are growing day by day?
Yes, thank you for that. It's a view I hear quite commonly expressed. I draw a distinction between Islam and Islamism.
Yes, well, we all know there is a
I know. But there is no getting away from the fact, and to come back to this idea of an intergenerational cultural model, unfortunately within the Muslim world there is a negative perception of Jews, for the same reason that there was a negative perception of Jews in Europe in the 20th century, and there is a negative perception of Jews around the Middle East. I think it's really important, though, to recognize, well, two aspects of this, and I think somebody touched on it earlier. We are a tiny minority. We are 0.2% of the world's population. I think I've got that right. Is that right? 0.2%.
Point something, yeah.
So we can't fight this battle, and we can't win this battle on our own. We need allies. And we need allies in the Christian world, and we need allies in the Muslim world. Now, if you're skeptical about that, let me tell you that the organization that I volunteer with, called Stand With Us, which is widely regarded as a pro-Israel organization, we work with many Muslim students and Muslim academics who are pro-Israel, who cannot stand Islamist ideology, who completely reject jihadist violence. Now, I don't know what proportion of the Muslim population they comprise. They may be a minority. I concede that they may be a minority. But we need to work with them. And the reason we need to work with them is not simply that it bolsters our numbers, but they are the ones who can influence their own communities.
There was a glimmer of hope with the Abrahamic Accords, the Gulf, the friendship between the Gulf, Saudi Arabia now, the books, the school books, they've changed.
They have.
Not the hatred that we've seen in Gaza, for instance.
Sorry, what's being said is that the Abraham Accords and the changing of school books has shown a change, and what that shows us actually is that authoritarian regimes see Islamism and the failed states and the chaos and the destruction it creates, and they look at that and they think, no thank you, we want to build, and we want to build for the future. And there has always been pragmatic voices, there's always been moderate voices, and actually after the war the lack of denazification meant that those moderate voices were silenced, and there have always been moderate voices even for the creation of the two-state solution. Again, they were silenced. It's time that we lifted those voices. There's many of them in places like Iran, and a lot of these regimes are very much against Islamism. So I don't think it's fair. I think we need to mind our language as well, and our terminology, as David touched on.
I would just add to that, if you were at any of these demonstrations calling for the release of the hostages, as well as seeing Israeli flags there, you'll have seen Iranian flags. There are many, many Iranians. I mean, where I live in Finchley, I'm surrounded by Iranians. And sometimes we talk about, if I'm in the barber or if I'm in a shop, sometimes the topic crops up of the Middle East.
And Kurdish flags as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
They loathe the current Islamic regime. That's why many of them left Iran.
it's very important that we don't have this us-them thing, because we need those allies. You know, there's more schizophrenics than Jews in the world. There's that few of us, as we've heard David say. So it's important that we don't other people and see them as the enemy. I would really, really suggest that is a bad idea.
Yes, but the other worry is what's happening in America. If Kamala comes in and she wins, Israel is getting in a deeper problematic situation.
Have we got any other questions? Adam?
Thank you very much for the talk. I was delighted that you actually brought up Inat Wilf, because I've got her book in my bag and I've started reading through it, and I could see the parallels that you were getting at through your talk and her work. One thing I wanted to sort of draw back to is back here in Britain, because obviously we're all British Jews, like we hold British citizenship, and you've touched upon that in certain societies there is this kind of, I wouldn't necessarily call it nascent, but like an undercurrent of accepted anti-Semitism, of this is just the social norm, this is just the way the world is meant to be. How much of that do you suspect is driving British government policy or British government thinking with regards to, say, funding UNRWA? I fully accept as well that there's the kind of halo effect around UN organizations of, you know, you can't go against an organization that has like a mandate of educate the children in it. But to what extent is the continual propping up of UNRWA, the continual pushing of the two-state solution, despite how failed it's been, how much of that has been driven by this kind of underlying sentiment of we buggered up in 1948, or in the British government mindset, we failed the world by giving the Jewish state and we want to undo it, but we want to keep our hands clean of it?
Yeah, I think the British Foreign Office has a lot to answer for. I don't know David Lammy personally, for example. I don't know what his worldview is, let alone what his attitude to Jews is. I know he's a member of Labour Friends of Israel. Unbelievably, he's a member of Labour Friends of Israel. What I do know is that the Foreign Office, like the US State Department, has been from day one fundamentally hostile to Zionism and to Israel. When Ernest Bevin stood up and made a speech, and that's quoted in the Nat Wilf's book that you mentioned, he stood up and made a speech in 1948 to the House of Commons where he explained why the UK was giving back the mandate to the UN. And actually, he got the diagnosis right. And I've quoted him in the book. What he said was that we cannot reconcile this, we can't resolve this conflict because we have two groups of people, one of which is determined to establish a Jewish state, and another group is determined to stop them establishing a Jewish state. Therefore, we're ending the mandate. Now, what he should have done was to have said, well, that is a completely unacceptable position for the Arab leadership to take. We have a mandate, and this is what they accepted in 1922 from the League of Nations that became the UN. We have a mandate to establish a Jewish national home in the territory we call Mandatory Palestine. And we will stick to that obligation that we committed ourselves to under international law. But instead, he walked away from it and that was what created the conflict. British betrayal of the League of Nations mandate, which when it started out in the 1920s, wasn't even opposed by the Arab world. And that, in turn, came out of the San Remo Declaration of 1920, which established all of the Arab states that emerged from the Ottoman Empire. And it was assumed by by those who drew up the mandate in the 1920s, there would be a Jewish state alongside the Arab states. But because of British treachery, if you like, that never happened. But the British government never apologised for that. They've never been called to account. And to this day, the British Foreign Office is hostile to Israel. Neither the British Foreign Office nor the US State Department believed Israel would survive the War of Independence. And they were rather shocked when things turned out rather differently.
It's a really interesting part of the book, by the way. You can read about the Cambon Declaration as well, and this kind of very underreported part of history of the Middle East and Britain and America. Should we have another?
Thank you very much for your talk, which I found very interesting and illuminating. And I've been puzzled by the attitude of Hamas, actually. And I really don't understand why. I know they planned this, or so we were told, they planned the operation for some time, maybe years. But what was the point? They must have known that is it's going to be a short and bloody event, that their fighters will achieve something and then they will be wiped out, because you can't send 3,000 or whatever it is fighters in against a country with a very good regular army and intelligence and a few million people behind them. So what exactly were they thinking of? Was it just to get headlines in the paper for a one-off event?
Well, you'd have to ask them that, is my first answer. I think we should recognize the nature of the organization. It is a death cult. It sanctifies death. And it regards every Palestinian death as a kind of victory. To our ears, that sounds perverse. But they have become so immersed in this ideology that they genuinely believe that the more martyrs that they send to heaven, the closer they will come to establishing a caliphate, a global caliphate, even if it means that their own leadership is wiped out. Now, I've heard it discussed on Israeli media, because this question keeps coming up. What did they expect to happen? I do believe they expected virtually everything that has happened to happen, with one missing ingredient. They believed there would be an attack from the northern border, from Hezbollah, at precisely the same time. But it seems that Hamas jumped the gun on October the 7th. The original plan, what the Israeli media are saying is the original plan was to attack on Yom Kippur. And that would be coordinated with an attack from the north, from Hezbollah, plus possibly an Iranian barrage of ballistic missiles. So there would be a multi-front attack. I think they genuinely believed that that would lead to a war in which they would emerge victorious. Actually, what happened was Hamas realized there was this enormous music festival taking place on Simchat Torah of last year. They just couldn't resist the opportunity to attack these young people. Bear in mind that to the Islamist mind, young people mixing freely, often as they would see it, provocatively and scantily clad, that, to them, that is an outrage. That is something that in itself is deserving of the ultimate sanction, namely death.
Upon the outrage of Israel as well. An outrage upon an outrage, right?
Correct. So although they regard the state of Israel as an abomination, within Israel, these very liberal values, by liberal I don't mean progressive, I mean liberal in terms of a liberal democracy, there's freedom of expression, freedom to go to a party in the Negev, to dance through the night. It was just too tempting a target. And Sinwar, who was the head of Hamas at the time, just pressed the button and said, go in and do it, kill as many as you can. Yes, yeah, sorry, I'll
Shall I
repeat
repeat?
it.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, so you're asking, do I have any data to support that contention? No. That is the speculation I'm hearing on Israeli media. Bear in mind that because, yes, I would love to see the data too, and I think it may emerge in time. Bear in mind that we are now in a position where we have access to a lot of documentation from both Hamas and Hezbollah because of the way things have been unfolding. It will take months, if not years, for that information to be sifted through by the Israeli intelligence services and ultimately made public. Some of it may never be made public. If there are data that support that contention, that it was actually a blunder, they were supposed to coordinate the attack and Hamas jumped the gun, if that is the case, that will emerge in time. It may already be known to Israeli intelligence, but for operational or other reasons, they may not wish to release that. But so watch this space is my answer to you. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up now. David will be available to sell his books and to sign his books. And please join me in thanking David once again for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
And thank you.
Yeah, it's really great, really enjoyable.
So I'd better head for my station.
Yes.
See, I've got all my post-it notes. I never use them. So. It's good. Yes. There is a two-stage. In other words, yes, the end of the process will be two states eventually, but it can't. But we shouldn't formulate it as a solution. I must wait to